In southwestern Ecuador, there is a fossil site called Tanqueloma that contains one of the strangest mass graves of prehistory in its layers. Lying there are the remains of thousands upon thousands of bones belonging to giant ground sloths, enormous herbivores that once roamed the Americas. But what makes this site especially unusual is not just the immense number of dead animals, not even that they all died at nearly the same time, but the way they did it. Because, as paleontologists would eventually discover, these giants met their end in the least dignified way imaginable and one of the most bizarre. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, I want to highlight that this is just one of the many strange deaths in Earth's history. And although I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable about fossilized deaths, after researching many grim, brutal, and unjust victims frozen in time through fossilization, lately I've wondered, what about the less brutal deaths that are simply rare, random, strange, those that make you wonder, how can something like that happen? And after doing some research, I found a few that I believe represent the most unbelievable deaths imaginable. And let's start strong, because this first fossil, or rather, fossils are quite extravagant. And it all starts in Ecuador, as I mentioned. Here at the Tanqueloma site, you'll find the remains of thousands upon thousands of bones that in life belonged to a group of large mammals known as giant ground sloths, and more specifically to the genus Aramotherium, an absolutely enormous herbivore that puts modern sloths to shame. It weighed around 4.5 tons and measured about 6 meters, which when standing up was 3 times taller than an average human. This makes it more comparable to an elephant than to its modern relatives. And this extended to its skeleton, which was absurdly robust and dense, so clearly it must have been difficult to kill. However, at Tanqueloma, researchers discovered nearly 24 of these fallen giants. Not only had they died in the area, but they had done so at the same time, dating their end to between 18,000 and 23,000 years ago. At first, it seemed quite obvious what had killed them, because like at the La Brea tar pits in the United States, this site had plenty of asphalt, which suggested that the sloths had been quickly buried in a sticky tar hell. It seeped through the wetlands where they lived. However, the strange thing was that the tar only covered part of their bodies, not all, while at the La Brea site, most bones were completely submerged. So this idea was discarded, and frankly, the tar would have been a more pleasant way to die, because as they continued digging, they found something strange. An entire layer surrounding the sloths, composed of chewed and digested plants. More simply, it was a complete layer of dung, large enough to cover a group that together would have weighed over 80 tons. We're talking about a level 2 worthy of Ian Malcolm. And you'd think this finding would lead to more confusion, but for the team it was not confusing at all, but rather the proof they were looking for, because it led to the hypothesis that the death of these giants was caused by themselves, or rather by their stomachs. Initially, they would have eaten plants from this place before depositing their remains in the pond, which was then a shallow pool. But slowly, over time, these bathroom visits accumulated and turned the pool into a toxic bucket of despair. In it, bacteria, parasites, and everything possibly proliferated. This caused the sloths to get disgusting diseases as they wallowed and drank water contaminated with pathogens that overcame them. It may be hard to believe, but this idea was based on a real incident from the 1970s, observed in Tanzania in a herd of 140 hippopotamuses taking refuge in a pond during a drought. In no time, their enormous amounts of waste turned that refuge into their downfall. And within a few weeks, the herd ended up losing over 100 members to disease, poisoning. In fact, the soil around the sloth's final resting place suggests they ended up in a situation exactly the same way due to a drought that forced them to crowd into an area with food and water, something that would seem like good news, but in this case the cramped space unknowingly doomed them to an unglamorous and somewhat muddy end. However, not all strange deaths have to be unpleasant. Just ask the frogs, more specifically those from 45 million years ago, found in a pit in the German region of Geiseltal. So far, we are not sure what species they were, but we believe they belonged to the still-living family Pelabatidae. In total, hundreds of individually fossilized frogs were identified within this cemetery, which at that time was an extensive marsh and a refuge for amphibians. So for a long time, Researchers had no idea why it seemed to have killed so many, and for decades it was considered an unsolved mystery. Since all the frogs appeared perfectly healthy at death without signs of disease, old age, predation, or scavenging. So the only thing paleontologists could examine was their position and number, which obviously isn't much. At first, it was thought that the only plausible cause was that their home had dried up quickly. But if that were the case, they could have gone elsewhere, given the abundance of swamps in the formation. So, this idea was discarded. However, a few years ago, after observing live frogs, paleontologists believe they have solved the dilemma. The answer being essentially that these frogs were too lively. Specifically, they noted that in certain modern frogs and toads, a major source of mortality was mating. Since during intense breeding seasons, many often succumbed to exhaustion after or during the act. This caused them to drown, especially females, which in some groups are pushed underwater by males. They also realized that these frogs from Geiseltal probably spent their lives on land and only returned to the swamp to reproduce, and therefore were not good swimmers, making these deadly frenzies more common and lethal. Now, although the frogs were having a good time, drowning is not the best way to die. Perhaps the only consolation is that it wasn't as prolonged as the death of another prehistoric animal, an extremely unfortunate pterosaur that died in such a strange way that we know no other fossil representing the same. The pterosaur in question was a Ludodactylus, a pterosaur from the early Cretaceous of Brazil, quite large, which alone is interesting because it looks almost exactly like what has become the children's toy of a pteranodon. And the other interesting thing is its holotype fossil for obvious reasons. You don't need a degree in paleontology to realize something is wrong, but the details are a bit more nuanced. That block you see, that seems to have become part of the Ludodactylus's jaw, is a yucca leaf, a plant still found in several countries. But how does a leaf end up as part of a pterosaur's body? One might think it was trying to eat it, and that, like a sharp Dorito, it got stuck directly in its mouth. But look at those teeth. This guy was not a vegetarian. Instead, the paleontologist who discovered this pterosaur estimates that while flying at high speed, this poor wretch crashed directly into a yucca plant, which, for those who don't know it, its leaves are nicknamed Adam's needle or Spanish bayonet for good reason, and in fact, some studies have linked it to increased gardening injuries, something that Ludodactylo learned that day, and the leaf became embedded in its lower jaw. That must have been very painful, and to its misfortune, it was only the beginning of its ordeal. In the following days, the injured pterosaur would have slowly died, unable to eat or drink with its deformed mouth while the wound became infected. It undoubtedly tried to get rid of the green spear, but its efforts were futile. It ended up dying from the accident, and as I said, since its discovery, no other fossil of a death caused by a leaf is known. And perhaps it's not so surprising, however. It turns out that plants and trees as a whole are much more bloodthirsty than one might think, and we know of other cases where they violently ended an animal's life. Within this exclusive club was none other than a Cretaceous turtle that was impaled by a tree, a highly unusual combination. Surprisingly, this find is only part of a larger discovery, since it comes from the Tanis site in North Dakota, which is almost the only known formation that has preserved animals killed directly by the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. And I think this fits the video because death by asteroid is something rare, bizarre, and, given the state of the fossils, painful. To illustrate, you should know that besides the impaled turtle, other notable deaths included a variety of fish, both marine and freshwater. They were found all mixed together kilometers inland, with their gills full of melted debris. In other words, they died inhaling lava. Additionally, ant nests were found full of asteroid fragments, a mummified Thescelosaurus from the injection, and many groups of non-avian dinosaurs shattered by violent waves. Unfortunately, the site is private, and many of the fossils found have remained hidden from the public. So who knows what else is waiting to be found. Another detail. Interestingly, the victims were often preserved in 3 dimensions, whereas normally fossils are crushed. And it is believed that this is because the violent waves that gathered many of the victims turned them, basically into canned sardines. And the incredible thing is that the formation is about 3,000 kilometers from the impact point, roughly the distance between Cairo and Paris. Even being so far away, life in the area endured massive earthquakes, seeches up to 100 meters high, and a powerful shock wave, and a rain of microtectites, small natural glass fragments formed during the impact. So, in other words, it was a bad day. And another thing that was completely beyond the victim's control was the case of a very unfortunate rhinoceros, which suffered its own rare and brutal death. To see it, we'll have to travel to the Turkish region of Cappadocia, a unique place with surreal, almost otherworldly landscapes. With countless strange formations, their construction was not the work of aliens, but of enormous volcanic eruptions from 3 ancient volcanoes, which took place millions of years ago, spewing lava everywhere and forming its rugged terrain that has led to some interesting findings. The most curious, at least in my opinion, was unearthed in 2012, when scientists located a solitary Ceratotherium, that is, the same genus as the white rhinoceros. This specimen was from an extinct species of the genus, which, although a bit smaller than its living relative, was no small matter, since it weighed over 2 tons, and yet it seems it was pulverized like an insect. The team only found the head, which was remarkably well preserved and with strange features such as a rough and corrugated surface, while the inside of its teeth was exceptionally fragile and corroded, signs that this rhinoceros was fried, dehydrated, and baked at once. It was so cooked that only one possibility occurred to them. Given the area, this extremely unfortunate rhinoceros was caught in a Vesuvius-like eruption that completely engulfed it, in a wave of lava exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, and obviously the pain must have been unimaginable. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you see it, it seems this Ceratotherium did not have to endure the lava for long, because shortly after, it was hit by a pyroclastic flow, a fast, hot avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic rock that, combined with the lava, ended up dismembering its entire body. And it explains why, despite being in perfect condition, only the skull was found. Moreover, it turns out that prehistoric rhinoceroses in general had a curious tendency to become lava feed. For we know of another case, this one in the United States, where something similar happened, though with an even stranger twist. In Washington state, a peculiar cave was discovered almost 100 years ago. It had a strange shape, was shallow, and had what looked like 2 points on top and a bulge on the left. After studying it for a while, researchers realized that shape was no coincidence, but rather the result of a mold that formed around a real animal, a rhinoceros in this case, probably a Diceratotherium, a North American genus from the late Oligocene to the Miocene. Hard to believe a fossil could be a cave, but the nearby bones of this beast supported the idea, as did the fact that the cave had the perfect shape of a dead rhinoceros lying on its back. Being on its back was key, because that's what we often see in large dead animals that are bloated and floating in water. Quite specific, but this specificity gave paleontologists the most likely story of what happened to this poor rhinoceros. It is believed that one day, while it was wallowing in a water source, it was interrupted by a volcanic eruption that sent lava towards it. But not very quickly, and it probably died from indirect heat and gases before the lava touched it. A perhaps more painful and prolonged end. Once dead, the rhinoceros would have started to bloat and float on the water, adopting the classic posture. Then the lava reached the water in its body, enveloping it in a hot tomb, while the water rapidly cooled the lava, forming a natural mold in which it was buried. Then, over millions of years, wind erosion cut the mold in two, exposing it to the world and completing its transformation into a genuine cave. After learning about this case, I hope that one day we also discover a dinosaur cave, but something tells me the chances are not good, and unfortunately, the odds are not good either. When it comes to figuring out another case of extremely rare prehistoric deaths, those of a creature not so far from home, the Australopithecus. No, I'm not talking about the famous specimen Lucy, who may have suffered her own unfortunate death, not by falling from a tree, but rather the one from AL 333-1, an extensive collection of bones and teeth that has become known as the first family. Located in the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia, this find was dated to about 3.2 million years ago, and it contained the remains of possibly more than 17 Australopithecines of different ages, but all apparently from the same family. It is very rare to find a group of early hominids that died in the same place at the same time. which aroused great interest and made it one of the most unique fossilized deaths we know of. However, it is not just what was found that makes this site rare, but the nature of their deaths. And although it is still not known exactly what happened, the most likely options are as rare as they are unusual. At first, it was thought the cause was a flash flood, something relatively common in mass deaths, but evidence in the surrounding sediments ruled out this idea. Therefore, a new theory was proposed. This theory pointed to the bleakest possibility that this place was the scene of a massacre unique in its kind. It was perpetrated not by other hominids but by genuine man-eaters. The question is by whom? Given the number of dead hominids, it had to be a pack hunter, which made the ancient giant hyenas the main suspect. But these devoured bones and left almost nothing, and in this case there were too many remains for them to be the culprits. So attention turned to the only other possible culprit. The big cats, some currently known for hunting in groups and killing in excess, that is, killing more prey than they could eat. They usually avoid bones, but often get a calcium boost by swallowing some bone. Generally, the fingers and toes are the ones that happen to be missing in mass at AL 333, which leads to the assumption that if predators were responsible, they were felines. The main suspects were saber-toothed cats, such as Homotherium, Megatherium, or Dinofelis. Not everyone agrees with this hypothesis. It is questioned how one or several predators could have killed more than a dozen Australopithecines at once. And we also do not know if these feline species lived in packs. Hence a second hypothesis emerges, less bloody but equally chaotic. This hypothesis suggests that this family had very bad luck with dinner, eating something that caused poisoning. That food poisoning was so violent that in a short time everyone was dead. Although it is not unheard of for poisoning to kill many animals in a short time, some researchers consider it exaggerated, given their vegetarian diet and that almost all died in the same place. But in the end, this strange case remains wrapped in mystery, and it is not the only one. For there is another unusual case that for a time was also a complete mystery, with fossils formed not by one, but by two different animals, the Jurassic fish Tharsis and the contemporary belemnites, a type of cephalopod. A few years ago, they began to appear together in the same fossils in a peculiar pose, similar to the incident of the pterosaur and the leaf. It should be obvious what is happening, but if you need a clue, you are seeing two animals fused together, not shoulder to shoulder, but the belemnite inside the fish, and it's not just in one fossil. The strangest thing is that several almost identical ones have been found, which prompts the understandable question of what the heck they were doing during the Jurassic. I mean, the Jurassic was already known to be crazy, but finding multiple samples of animals impaled on each other is still something crazy, with few clues in the end. The first obvious step would be to identify who was eating whom, but even this proved difficult. The belemnite almost certainly would never try to take on a fish of that size, and although they had hard internal shells that could pierce things at high speed, their class was not known to use them to invert. For its part, the fish Tharsis was larger, but a known microcarnivore that fed on decomposing soft tissue and suspended organic remains, and therefore, it did not hunt squid half its length. So detective work was needed. Just a few weeks ago, a breakthrough was achieved when paleontologists noticed something peculiar in all the cephalopods involved. They had a bunch of bivalves growing on them, a sign that perhaps they were dead before the perforation. This led to the hypothesis that, already dead and full of small animals, these belemnites began to float to the surface, their internal shells filled with gas. Once on the surface, they became fatally deceptive traps for Tharsis, which had a tendency to suck in floating objects. Normally, the difference in size between the fish and the objects or their shape would prevent a catastrophe, but in this situation, the unusual size of the fish and the aerodynamic design of the belemnite's rostrum made these predicaments surprisingly common, in which the cephalopod's tip slid directly into the mouth of the Tharsis, entering its not-so-pleasant gills, and once unable to get rid of the improvised lance, it would suffocate to death. So there you have it, a collection of some of the strangest deaths preserved in the fossil record, from giant sloths that literally drowned in their own waste to frogs that died from too much frenzy, and perhaps the strangest thing of all, It's just that these are only the deaths we have managed to find and tried to understand. For every strange fossil death we discover, there are millions, if not billions, more, of which we will never know, either because they didn't fossilize or because we haven't found them yet. These fossils serve more than just curiosity or morbidity. They are windows to the past that show that life has always been unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and often strange. It is a reminder that despite all our technology and knowledge, we remain at the mercy of luck, bad timing, and Mother Nature. Furthermore, it proves that no matter how strong you are, whether you are a 4-ton sloth or a 4-meter flying reptile, nature, physics, and chance will always find a way to humiliate you. So, the next time you have a bad day, remember, at least you're not a Jurassic fish with a dead squid stuck in your gills. Thanks for watching this video from Extinct Zoo. See you in the next one.